You ever have one of those moments at work where you catch yourself holding back and you don't really fully realize why? Like you're double checking how loud your laugh was, or you're about to share an idea and you hesitate just long enough for someone else to jump in. Or you apologize before you speak, even when you didn't do anything wrong. For so many ADHD women, this fear of being too much is almost instinctive. It's in the nervous system, it's in the childhood conditioning, it's in years of being told directly or indirectly that our full being takes up too much space. And I've lived this. I've been told I was too intense, too direct, too loud, that I asked too many questions, that I was too silly or playful, even when the room needed someone to shake up the energy. And I want to be honest about something. I did struggle with feeling not enough when I was younger, especially before therapy. But over time, instead of walking around consciously feeling not enough, I shifted into a pattern of trying to make sure no one ever thought that about me. So on the outside, it looked like confidence. It looked like competence. It looked like I was the one who always had it together. But internally, I was still operating from that younger part of me, that one who worried she wasn't doing things right or wasn't keeping up or needed to prove her worth by being hyper capable, hyper prepared, hyper responsible. I didn't necessarily feel not enough anymore because I was constantly over functioning to outrun that feeling. And then one day in a workshop for entrepreneurs, the presenter said, the flip side of feeling not enough is feeling like you're too much. They come from the same place. And that hit me right in the gut because suddenly it made sense. So many of us don't feel not enough on the surface. We've learned to compensate for it by shrinking, softening, or overperforming. And here's the thing. Even when we don't think we're playing small, many of us still are. Every time we tone down our energy, limit our enthusiasm, hold back our ideas, or try to manage how we're being perceived, we're pulling away from our authentic self. And the cost of that, it's not just emotional, it's physical, it's nervous system level depletion. It's the quiet collapse that happens when your system is working overtime to monitor every part of yourself. In this episode, we're going to talk about it, the fear of being too much at work, how it forms, how it shows up for ADHD women, and how it silently shapes our confidence, visibility, and career paths. Be sure to listen. Welcome to the Self-Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD-ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing, and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. This is such a common, quiet experience for ADHD women. And today I want to help you understand what's really going on, why it happens, where it comes from, and how to reclaim the parts of you that have been tucked away for far too long. Let's get into it. So, I want to first talk about what this feeling about being too much really is. And so much of it is felt in our nervous system. It tends to be like this fear of being too much tends to be a way a part of us is protecting us. And what is it protecting us from? Well, likely over the course of your life, you have been given messages that you were too much, too loud, too intense, too sensitive, whatever it is. Like I said in the intro, you've likely experienced this. So then what your body does, what the parts of you do, what your nervous system does is protects you so that doesn't happen again. Because there was some wounding when people said those things to you. I don't know about you, but I had a lot of deep wounding around being too sensitive or talking too much or being too loud. And in fact, Rosalind Wiseman in her book, Queen Bees and Wannabes, actually talks about girls being taught to like play nice and quiet. And so, for those of you with inattentive ADHD, you might be like, I did. I didn't need to quiet myself. But if you're anything like me, you might have been really loud and playful and silly and gotten told you were being too much or too loud or you need to quiet down. I especially got told that in Catholic school. My parents, well, not so much. They just kind of, it was, I don't know, mostly we just went and played outside. So maybe that was their way of of telling me I was too much, is like, go play outside. But thankfully, because that was a different message, rather than it was something defective about me. I was just a kid being loud, which some kids do. And so when we are like, oh, we don't want to be too much, it's all protective. It's just younger parts of us being like, well, that didn't go well in the past when we were too much. And again, if you had inattentive ADHD, that might not be your thing. Or maybe you're like, no, Jen, I always feel not enough. And we're going to get into the paradox of that a little bit later in the episode. But first, I want to just talk about this too muchness. Because the thing is this, for a lot of us, we might have shown up as quote unquote too much for people well into our working years. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I don't know about you, but just because I was in college didn't mean I completely toned down my personality or my ADHD that I didn't know I had. It definitely didn't happen when I was an actuary. I remember teaching, I was a group fitness instructor for 17 years, and that coincided with when I was an actuarial analyst. And so I remember like teaching people the correct way to do squats in in between the cubicles. Like, how did someone not realize I had ADHD? I don't know. But at any rate, I remember that. And thankfully, I didn't get in too much trouble for doing that, at least not verbally. But I could tell there were definitely some of the higher ups who did not appreciate my enthusiasm. While my boss, actually, she seemed to kind of get a kick out of me. So that was kind of nice. But generally speaking, I didn't make myself smaller. I was still my loud self when I went in to be an actuary. And in fact, that wasn't, I mean, I kind of got through that mostly being an actuary that way. But eventually, as I got older and older, it became less and less acceptable, especially as I became a social worker. I was all of a sudden supposed to be like this like super professional, and professional meant quiet because I don't know who decides that, but definitely not someone with ADHD who has hyperactive presentation. But we get that message. But before we get the message, if you're like me, you probably got in trouble. You probably, I don't know, I got in trouble one time. I was like making a joke that was a little over the top, and I got in trouble where I taught group fitness. I got pulled in, I got written up for it. Wasn't even that bad. It wasn't offensive. It was just, I don't know, too much for someone. Or maybe you got in trouble other places, got in trouble for being too direct. I definitely got in trouble for that. Or told to tone down your intensity. And so if you received those messages, then you likely have parts of you that are protecting you from receiving those messages again, because chances are it didn't really go well for you. I know it didn't go well for me. And especially because we tend to be highly sensitive when we get talked to, even if the person doing the talking to, which I find that annoying, but whatever, even if they're not super harsh, it's still like we feel like we're in trouble. We feel like the way we naturally are is defective or not okay, too much or not enough. And so this fear of being too much then is really rooted in the wounds of when people gave us that message in the past. And so our parts protect us, but so does our nervous system. And this can result in us being almost hypervigilant, like we're always looking for, oh my gosh, am I being too much? Like we're trying to modulate ourselves. Being really intentional with how we speak, or then sometimes not. We're just impulsive and say shit. And then later we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. I'm going to be in trouble. They're going to hate me. And then we think about it over and over. We ruminate about it for days, sometimes weeks, unless we catch ourselves doing it and have the tools to stop. So much of this fear of being too much is now basically fear of being re-traumatized, being wounded again, being judged, being rejected, being criticized. And that's all super valid because no one likes being told that their natural way of being isn't right, especially if they're not like hurting anyone. I'm not saying if your natural way of being is to be racist or homophobic or whatever, I'm not giving permission to that. That's just not okay. That may have been what you learned growing up, and I cannot be okay with that. That's something that's work that's there to do because it's unsafe for other people. But you being your ADHD self is not unsafe for others. I mean, unless you're driving like this, I mean, that might be unsafe. But generally speaking, that's not what we're talking about here. So if you were given the impression that your natural way of being with your ADHD brain, whether you knew you had it or not, was not okay, now your nervous system is protecting you. And one thing that can happen is like as we increase our visibility, as we speak out more, or maybe you get promoted or you're in leadership roles, these parts of us can be even more scared. And so we can feel like we put ourselves in even more of a box, shrinking ourselves even more because it becomes less and less safe to be seen. And so before we get into some of the labels that we've internalized, you might consider this reflection question. It can be something that can anchor you in moments of when you're afraid of being too much. And that question might be, is the fear like, is this about my personality and who I am, or is this more about the fear of being judged or fear of being called too much or not enough? So before we get into the labels that we tend to internalize and what that does, you might sink into this anchoring question that you can use when you're feeling this like, oh my gosh, I'm being too much, or was I too much? And that question is essentially, how much of this is really about how I showed up? And how much of it is attached to a fear response or a protection response related to past experiences? And you can just ask yourself that question and pause and sit with it in those moments of when you're, I don't know, maybe freaking out or ruminating, thinking over and over about what happened. And so now I want to shift into some of these labels that we have internalized. And it could be that we talk too much, we're too intense, we're too excited or enthusiastic, or you ask too many questions, or you're too silly or playful. And so a lot of times our ADHD traits that are common to us get misinterpreted, especially for women, where our directness is seen as confrontational or even judgmental, or our energy is seen as unprofessional or immature. Our enthusiasm is seen as annoying, and our curiosity is seen as questioning someone's authority. And perhaps our playfulness is also seen as unprofessional, and our emotions are seen as instability, when the reality is those ways of being are some of our greatest gifts. They are the things that allow us to offer a unique perspective. And further, it's often that we're not too much, but that the people around us haven't yet learned how to interpret neurodivergent ways of communicating and being. And so now I want to get into this paradox of being not enough or too much. So I used to think they were two completely different things. And kind of how I shared in the intro, I mean, I remember feeling like I wasn't enough in high school, which I think maybe everyone feels in high school. I don't know. I think some people think they're awesome, but maybe they're pretending. I have no idea. I will say, having been a school social worker and meeting some of the popular kids, they also didn't feel like they were enough. So that's just what makes me think that. And even in college, I remember feeling not enough and I just needed to push, push, push. And a lot of times with ADHD, especially those of us who masked through overfunctioning and high achievement, we did feel like we weren't enough. But then we overfunctioned and we were able to because of just what we were given in this life, whether that was a loving family or our intellectual abilities, whatever it is. But for whatever reason, we were able to overfunction and achieve highly. So then, at least on the outside, we didn't feel like we weren't enough, but maybe some of us felt like we were too much. But I never saw those two things as the same until I was at a workshop, kind of a workshop for entrepreneurs. And they were talking about, like, oh, if you feel not enough, do this, feel not enough, do this. I was like, I don't feel not enough. I feel pretty confident and capable. I've done enough of my inner healing that in this stage of my life, I don't really feel like I'm not enough. Not to mention the years of overfunctioning and high achieving, but even now, I don't really feel not enough. And she was like, "Well, do you feel like you're too much?" I was like, "Well, yeah, all the time." She's like, "Well, that's just the other side of the same coin. They come from the same place." And I was shocked and thought about it. And she wasn't wrong because both have to do with our natural way of being not being okay. Both have to do with shame. And sure, not enough might be shame that we're not good enough or whatever. And too much might be afraid others are going to shame us. Sure. But at their baseline, they come down to not really thinking we're a good person, that we're too much. And I will say, in my now 50s, which is weird to start saying, but in my 50s, I have found that, like, I will say I'm too much for those people. But what if it's just that those people can't handle my energy and it doesn't have anything to do with me? And I would suggest the same is true for you. But because of this, these messages that we got throughout the course of our life, that you're being too loud or too sensitive or too emotional or too whatever, insert adjective in judgment, whatever it is, we took on this shame. We took on this idea that we were somehow defective. And so then that leads to all this fear that we have now that then results in us making ourselves more palatable, making ourselves small. So how do we make ourselves small? Right? We get the why. We a lot of times we just want to feel more comfortable. We want to be accepted. And who doesn't want to be loved and accepted? Belonging, loving, and acceptance are part of our root needs as a human being. And so how does this then show up for ADHD women? Well, you might dull your edges to avoid conflict or judgment. I know I certainly have. I remember learning in my 20s that as a social worker, I couldn't be direct. When I was an actuary as a woman, I could be direct. It was fine. No one took any offense. So I was like, oh, I think that number is off. No one took that to mean anything. But I learned when I was a social worker, if I said something like, oh, what if you tried this? That all of a sudden they took that as me thinking I know better than them or something like that. I don't know, which I now see wasn't about me. It was just me sharing an idea that I had, but they took it to mean it was about me. So I learned just to, like, say things like, oh, you probably already thought about this, but because you're awesome at what you do, but maybe this is what's coming up for me. I don't know. If you haven't thought of it already, I wonder what it would be like to give that a try, which is so shrinking yourself to protect someone else's ego. And what it does for you if you are doing that, and I was doing it for years, I'm trying to do it less and less, but what it does to us then is we are making ourselves so small so we're palatable and avoiding conflict and avoiding rejection. And that's one way making ourselves small can show up. Another way is maybe we just shut down our natural energy so that it's not too intense for people. Or we take ourselves out of situations so that people don't get sick of us. Or maybe we disconnect from our desire or our creativity or even leadership. We might just be like, oh no, because maybe some of that offers too much visibility and opportunity for criticism that we would receive that we really, even if you've got the skills to work through, maybe you just don't have the energy to deal with, especially if you're taking on more responsibilities in a leadership role. It could be that you stop trusting your instincts, or maybe even that you feel like a spectator in your career, right? Like you feel like you're watching yourself do it, but not really the one making the decisions or in control. And so this has some real costs, including to your nervous system. This puts you almost like in this like chronic self-monitoring, which is exhausting, but also some hypervigilance, which is essentially staying in your fight or flight response more often than not. And if you've heard me talk before about nervous system regulation, you know then that this is going to limit your capacity to focus and feel motivated and have access to your creativity, not to mention the consequences to your health. So there's some real consequences to this. Also, this suppressing your impulses will just increase the likelihood that you shut down entirely with all those other nervous system issues. But again, you're going to have a hard time motivating yourself to do things. So then masking becomes who you are. It becomes so automatic, you start to lose touch with who you really are. And burnout then becomes inevitable. And that's not where we want to be. And all of this has consequences to your career of maybe getting overlooked for promotions because you aren't putting forth your creative ideas, or people aren't seeing the real you, or maybe you're too tired to take on the projects that you would need. Or I don't know, maybe you're not making the connections that you need to make because you're playing small so you don't annoy people and get in trouble. All of this has consequences. And yet the reality is there are parts of you who are so scared that if you stop doing it, you would fall apart. Because playing small isn't about you not being capable. It's about your nervous system not feeling safe. And you probably have plenty of childhood conditioning that got you here. As girls, if you're anything like me, you likely heard that you were supposed to tone it down or be quieter, to play nice, or don't be so emotional or sensitive, or stop interrupting, or you're being dramatic. And these messages get stored in your body to not take up space, to not like, don't be noticed unless it's really safe. Or don't draw attention to yourself. Or don't be different, which is a problem because with ADHD, we are different. We're unique. And quite frankly, it's freaking beautiful. It's just that not everyone can fully handle it, especially when we don't feel empowered in ourselves to just show up and they can do whatever they want. And then we just deal with whatever they happen to do, right? Like let them do them. Be yourself and then let them do what they're going to do. And then you get to do what you need to do next. But some of the work is helping yourself, number one, have the tools to do that when people don't like something you said or did. But then secondly, be able to regulate and just keep going in the face of rejection or criticism. Maybe even to say, this isn't about me, this is how I am. And again, I'm not talking about this is how I am and saying shitty things and being an asshole. I'm just saying, like, if you're being enthusiastic and someone doesn't like it, that's not about you. You get to be who you are too. And so before we move on, I want to just say there are many things that can trigger this in the workplace. Authority figures often do it. Getting feedback, if someone's like, "Hey, I need to talk to you in my office later," that triggers all of this fear, right? Or even performance evaluations, group meetings when there's this intense hierarchy and you can't just talk to people. And so a lot of times your adult self is at work, but your younger self is the one doing all the managing. And quite frankly, she's not old enough to navigate this anymore. This isn't for her, this is for you. And you can learn how to effectively manage and navigate all of this now, because truly you've got this. So before we get into how to do that, I just want to validate, like, of course, this visibility and being yourself can feel threatening, right? The more exposure could be more potential for criticism or rejection. And then your RSD spirals or fear of letting people down. It could even be fear of being misread or being judged for your enthusiasm. So, of course, this feels like a sensitive thing where you're like, I don't know, Jen. I don't know if I can handle it. But this is real. It's just how our ADHD is. And so, like I said, this is valid. So much of it is tied to ADHD with our emotional sensitivity and our tendency to have rejection sensitive dysphoria and our tendency to show up a little differently socially. Not to mention our dopamine loops that impact how we manage ourselves and our default mode network activation, which tends to make us more highly distractible. All of this are real things that show up in the workplace that could give someone an opportunity to judge us. And I'm not saying we don't work on these things for ourselves. We certainly do. It's just that it can feel kind of tender walking around with ADHD full out in the open for everyone to see, especially in a corporate environment. Even in agencies as a therapist, I had to mask who I was. In fact, sometimes even more so in those, which is interesting because you think there'd be more acceptance, but not necessarily. There's a lot, that word professionalism gets thrown around a lot. So, what do we do then? A lot of times we default to things like over apologizing or fawning, right? Like the people pleasing and trying to do what people want. But whatever it is, we in some ways make ourselves small. And we don't have to keep doing this because having ADHD that's not a commitment to like not be who you are. We don't ask people with diabetes to be less diabetic. I mean, unless it's bad for their health, sure, like they could die, but we're not like, oh, your diabetes is annoying. You should probably get that checked out. And if we are saying, like, oh, you should lose some weight, then that's fat phobia, and that's also not okay. So, having ADHD doesn't mean that you're just like stuck in a life of playing small. So now let's get into what do we do? How do we help ourselves be more of our authentic self? And I'm not saying we don't have moments where maybe we have an impulsive thought in a meeting and we let someone finish what they're saying before we speak. I'm not saying that we never do that, especially if everyone else in the room is neurotypical and we haven't communicated with them about like, hey, I've got ADHD. This is how I communicate. I'm not saying we can't ever do that or we don't choose to do that, but here's some ways to start to work on what's going on inside of you so that you can show up more fully outside of yourself. Number one, and this is almost always first, is nervous system regulation. If we are in our fight or flight response or shutdown response, we are just not going to be able to show up authentically or handle it when we do. And that hypervigilance, that like, oh, trying to perform or fawn or follow what someone else is doing, that is not a regulated nervous system. We are not grounded into our authentic selves when we are dysregulated. And so in order to be authentic, it's important to regulate. So how do we do that in a work environment? Well, if you're in a meeting, slow breaths, maybe putting one hand on your heart and breathing. There's a lung meridian here, so it can actually be very regulating to put your hand there. Could put your other hand on your belly if that doesn't seem too much for you. We're using the word too much while we're talking about not being too much. But you get what I'm saying. Like if you feel comfortable doing this, but not having your hand on your belly, then just do one. You might just even bring your attention to your breath. If you're at your desk, maybe you go for a walk. It could be around the block outside, but if you're not allowed to leave the building, I didn't know that I had ADHD when I was an actuarial analyst, but I would go for walks around the building, kind of connecting with people and talking to people, but they were certainly walks. That's a way to move my body and get out some of that energy. But however you do it, it's important to regulate your nervous system as a way to be able to be more fully yourself. And then start to explore who you really are. Maybe ask yourself, who would I be at work if I wasn't afraid of people judging, rejecting, or, I don't know, silencing me? If I wasn't afraid of that judgment, rejection, or criticism, who would I be at work? That's a big question. And I'm not saying you have to do that immediately, but just ask yourself. And you might even see if your adult self, even if it's your getting along with day-to-day life part, even if it's not your highest self, if you've done a IFS, you know what I mean. But an adult part of you, even if it's an adult part of you that meets with your younger part and says, like, hey, I've got this. Like, I know how to communicate well if something happens. I don't like the discomfort of conflict, but we've got it. Because chances are you probably have skills. If you've ever been in a supervisory role, I gotta believe you got some skills for effective communication. So letting your younger part know that, like, I've got this, you don't have to stress. And then starting to shift those limiting beliefs that you have adopted from your youth. Maybe seeing mistakes as learning opportunities or conflict as an opportunity to work on the relationship with someone. I'm not saying we create conflict on purpose for that, but think about times when you've had really healthy conflict and you've gotten to know each other better. You probably got closer. If you haven't had a healthy conflict, then, definitely recommend reading on nonviolent communication. That's a great way to start. But what if the conflict is just a way to build a relationship? Boundaries are a way to create space to do what you really came here to do. Curiosity is your thirst for knowledge and desire to understand the world. It's even a kind of leadership. And your intensity, your emotions are actually some of your biggest guides around, like, hey, do this more, or ooh, this is not, something's off here. And so you can do that for yourself, but you can also start to make comments to people when you're in an environment like, oh, I just get really excited about things. That's part of the fun of knowing Jen. Or, oh, yeah, when I feel negative or icky about something, that tells me, like, maybe there's something off here that we need to dig into. Or, I don't know, whatever it is that you do. Or, oh, I just ask a lot of questions because I like to really unpack things and understand. I'm not at all questioning your who you are as a person or your capacity or whatever. And not that we always have to explain ourselves, but just letting people know, oh, I just do this in a nonchalant way can help them be more accepting. And honestly, the last one I'll talk about today is creating small moments for you to be more of yourself, to have more visibility in your natural way of being, your natural habitat. But how might you do that? Okay, maybe you speak up in a meeting or, something I've been doing, and this is different for me, is actually because I tend to blurt things out right away and then it's never actually what I want to say. And for me, that's about, like, I feel like I'm trying to, like, please the presenter or make them more comfortable, which is my own stuff to work through. So what I've been doing is really focusing on listening and really listening to what other people are saying and starting to piece it together and then later saying something. I find that those later comments are actually coming from a deeper place inside of me and are more authentic to who I am rather than my off the cuff thought. And you might be the opposite. You might be like, oh no, I do that way too much and then I never speak up. So it's really about figuring out, like, where is it that you're not showing up? Where is it that you're playing small? And what's a small way you can shift that? Maybe you ask to be on a bigger project than you normally would. Or maybe you show up with your full enthusiasm, and when people are like, geez, Jen, that's a lot. And you can be like, I know, isn't it great? Or I know, I'm excited. This is so cool. Are you excited? Right? Instead of I can't think of the word I want. Instead of being self-deprecating, you can lean into the awesomeness of your enthusiasm. Or finding other small ways to practice visibility and being more of who you are in a way that you haven't done yet. and letting yourself practice handling it, because there are going to be times when people reject you. There are going to be times when people are annoyed or whatever. That's not your stuff. Let them be annoyed. Let them reject you. Let them judge you. That's not on you. Then you get to do what you want to do in response to whatever comes up. And I'm not suggesting, if your boss is like, hey, if you show up to late to work one more time, you're fired. Well, yeah. Okay, we've got time blindness and that's valid. And if you can request an accommodation for your time blindness, fantastic. But that one, you might figure out how to be on time for work. I'm not suggesting you openly defy something that your boss has literally talked to you about that you haven't said, like, I've got time blindness, I'm doing the best I can. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, let's see how we can work with it. If they're like, no, you need to be on time or you're fired, all right, maybe that's not the thing that you're gonna be full ADHD in. But find the small ways to practice it and then practice coping with whatever happens. And seeing that, you know what? You actually can handle this. And if you're like, I actually can't, Jen, you know what? What a great opportunity for you. What a gift. Because then you see that, wow, maybe you need some help. Whether you need a coach or a therapist to help you figure some of this out, now would be a great time to reach out for that. So the thing is you were never too much. You were never not enough. You've always been just right who you are. It's just that your environment and the people in it don't always get it. But the more you shrink yourself, the less they have opportunity to get it. And this is why we learn, like, how do we learn with when people don't get us or like us? Because I'm going to tell you something, the more fully I've been myself, the more I attract the right people and opportunities into my life. And yeah, I've had loss. I have other things fall away, but that's okay because that stuff wasn't for me. If you're interested in doing some of this deeper work, I created without doing like one-to-one coaching or something like that, I created a journal book experience, which is actually a tangible journal. It comes in a box with these hand-selected sensory items to do the self-love uh, ADHD woman way ritual. And so there's that, but also the journal book experience is actually a way to work with these parts of yourself that have you playing small and to really dig into some of this underlying stuff of feeling like you're too much or not enough and everything else in between. So I'll link it in the description, the show notes of the podcast, the description of the YouTube video, whatever you've got. And if you're watching this and you found this helpful in any way, I would love it if you would subscribe or like or share with another ADHD woman. Because you know what? We're all in this together and let's help each other. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time. Take good care.